مساء الخير.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome all to this session. Our third session today is about the severity of digital threats and their impact on journalists and fact checkers, and also the independent media foundations. Now, as you know, we live in a very developed digital era, and its reflections on media is huge, but also there are a lot of challenges and speculations coming of that development. Is also fears that we need to mention. Today, we believe we cannot ignore the digital threats because the cyber attacks and violations are continuing threats to the work of journalists and fact checkers. It's also a type of pressure and restriction of the freedom of speech and also the access to information. I'm really glad today to have three panelists who are experts in that regard. We begin with Ms. Muna Shtia. She's the manager, campaign and partnership manager at MENA and corporate engagement and lead of digital action. She is also a fellowship and resident in Middle East, and she is a researcher in the issues of Palestine in the Middle East institution. Also, Hadra Mariam, she's a MEDRA manager at Amnesty Tech, which is a global group of defenders and activists and experts of violations with Amnesty. Also, our colleague Raya Sharbin, she is also a manager of TOR project. She is expert in digital security in Tor. Welcome all, and we begin with you, dear Mona.
Thank you so much, Rasha, and I'm glad to be here with a great lineup of speakers. So to start with, speaking about digital threats that journalists are facing, but also other human rights defenders on social media platforms. And I do like, since we are in December and we are like now almost approaching to the year of 2024, which is, we call it the year of democracy because of the elections mega cycle that's gonna happen all over the world, where over 2 billion people around the world are going to choose to elect their representatives over the next year, in over 65 elections around the world. And like, just to set the scene, whenever we are speaking about that, we are speaking about digital threats that might face people on social media platforms, starting from like privacy breaches to disinformation, hateful content, as well as doxing, among other gender-based violence, among other digital threats that might face journalists and other human rights defenders, as well as normal users on social media platforms. And unfortunately, social media platforms are not investing enough resources to protect people on their platforms, neither journalists. It's like their investment, like their resources investment to protect people and elections is depending on the market size, not on the assessed risk. And we can see that clearly in the current and ongoing crisis in Gaza Strip, where social media platforms are flooded with disinformation, hateful content, gender-based violence, privacy breaches, among other digital threats that are that spread all over. And just to give a clear or more particular context, whenever we are speaking about those digital threats, we should highlight how the different investments or there is a lack of investment whenever it's coming to the global majority countries. However, when we are speaking about the global north countries, it's different because social media platforms think about where they are held to account legally, because they emerged in global north countries, more particularly in the US. And it's clear, like just a couple of days ago, Meta, they announced their elections for the next year, elections plan for the next year. And if any one of you have just a look on that, it's clear from the first initial blog that they highlighted the US rather than speaking about inclusive platforms for everyone around the world. And keeping in mind the context in global majority countries and maybe our region, in the MENA region, how different political dynamics and context might also put an extra level of pressure on journalists and the human rights defenders, where certain legislations, governmental legislations, are restricting and shrinking the spaces to free press and to the right to labor. We can see also social media platforms and the digital threats are contributing to shrink those spaces more and more. And just again, I want to bring some highlights from the current and ongoing crisis in Gaza, where some journalists are facing constant censorship on social media platforms, which is constantly affecting their right to labor, which is their fundamental right. If we are censoring journalists' voices online, restricting their accounts, suspending their content, or taking that down, or shadow banning them, then we are denying them their fundamental right to work as well as the right to free press. So looking at other countries, also in our region, but beyond that, we can see how different digital threats such as hateful content or defamation campaigns are also weaponized against journalists. And if we just look at the dynamics, we can see how digital threats are also affecting more female journalists more than other journalists in our region. So we're today speaking about challenges that's not like only in certain region or in certain country. We're speaking about the global digital threats that are facing journalists everywhere, but also whenever we are speaking about global majority countries, it's an extra layer of oppression, keeping in mind the context where legislations are also contributing to restrict their right, like their different rights to work and to freedom. So that said, we at Digital Action, we started something called the Global Coalition for Tech Justice, where we joined the forces with over 170 organizations and experts from around the world to launch the campaign, which is the Year of Democracy campaign, where we are aiming to pressure social media platforms to invest more resources to protect people and elections over the next year. And again, this is the biggest elections mega cycle in our lifetime, I think. And if we pass this successfully, we are establishing for a different kind of a platforms. We're establishing for safe and just platforms for everyone, inclusive platforms for people in global majority countries as well as people in other parts of the world. And if you are interested, you can just visit the Year of Democracy website and you can have a look there. You can, you are more than welcome to join the movement, because we are looking at different kind of collaborations. And here, I want to just end up with this point. We are always counting on investigative journalists' efforts to investigate more tech harms on democracy and people. I know that you yourselves, journalists themselves, are facing the different digital threats, but also it's more complicated when it comes to normal people around the world. That's why we are counting on the investigations on how tech harms are affecting people's rights in different parts of the world, especially in global majority countries, where we can pressure more social media platforms to change their policies, to protect more people, to protect electoral systems, and to have this digital spaces as much as we can, to be safe spaces for everyone. I'll stop here, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
شكرا منى وشكرا أيضا لإلقائك الضوء على وجود
Thank you for shedding light on the risks and threats that women are subject to in this digital world. Of course, we would come back to you with too many questions. Now with our colleague Hajra and a brief thing on her own experience and her comment on this, please.
Thank you so much, ARIJ, for having me here today. So at Amnesty International, our team of forensic experts and human rights experts, we do analyze the human rights impact of surveillance technology. However, I'll clarify over here, by surveillance technology right now in this panel, I mean cyber surveillance and the use of spyware. And of course, like we have observed that how such cyber surveillance tools, like for instance, the Pegasus investigation that was exposed back in 2021, it does produce kind of a chilling effect across society, especially targeting journalists and human rights defenders. Now, before I go into kind of like deeper analysis of our latest investigations and the industry as such, one thing I want to highlight, because most of the people I assume sitting over here are journalists, is kind of the framing effect of any issue regarding spyware, especially in Western media. Whenever we are seeing, like we have observed stories about spyware and targeting in the Middle East or North Africa or in Asian countries, there is kind of like a double standard editorial approach into talking about spyware by journalists. For instance, they frame the issue as like, in these authoritarian regimes or these dictatorships, people are being targeted. And I don't know, it's like in the Western mind, they are kind of posing themselves as a savior when they're reporting about these issues. So we need to realize that the spyware crisis and the surveillance crisis as such is kind of a massive global problem. And a lot of the industry is also mushroomed in the EU space itself. The EU has kind of failed as a bloc to impose binding regulation and bans on the exports of such products. So yeah, I mean, it is well documented that impacts of such digital surveillance is kind of a human rights crisis. A human rights crisis is more like a feature of spyware rather than a bug, and it has kind of it has targeted journalists, civil society groups, and then as a whole, it also impacts the social movements, so to speak, in certain contexts. One thing I would also like to highlight that where the cases that we have documented is mental health impact on journalists when they find out that they have been targeted through a spyware. It could be Pegasus, it could be Predator. So it kind of produces a very extreme chilling effect on them. People feel scared to talk to people. People feel scared to move around. People have changed their locations, so on and so forth. And it also has a greater impact on women journalists, so to speak, because I'm glad this panel is like an all-women panel on such a technical issue. I think that is kind of really the case. But it has a greater impact on women journalists and people from the LGBTQ community. For instance, for women, they, automatically, I think it's kind of a reflex arc that people accuse women of not following certain moral compass and sexual norms in society. One incident that I would like to highlight. So basically, recently, back early in May, we found the first case of Pegasus spyware being used against a very high-profile journalist, Nuria Piera. And this is what she exactly described how she felt. She said that you have to work hard to not become neurotic, because you're always suspicious that someone may have information about you. It's like being in quicksand. It really affects your sense of freedom, how free you feel to speak up. Sometimes you don't even know how they want to hurt you, through you are or through your loved ones. You then feel responsible, which is even more serious. So yeah, Nuria Piera is a high-profile woman journalist. It's the first documented case of predator spyware in Dominican Republic. So yeah, it has this kind of like a very greater impact, I would say, on women journalists, so to speak. So yeah, just moving on from this as well. Even in our recent reports, for instance, we have observed that the EU has greatly failed. I mean, globally, I would say, big states, especially the global north countries, who kind of showcase themselves as the defender of human rights. They have failed to regulate this industry and outright ban these abusive surveillance technologies. The Predator spyware and Pegasus spyware are to give examples. So we do need a binding regulation. We need an outright ban on the use of such tools. In our most recent study, we exposed the Intellexa Alliance. It is kind of like a group of, it's a complex web of companies that are exporting surveillance, spyware, and technology across the world. And it's very interesting how some of these companies, the Intellex Alliance and even the NSO Group, which I'll come to later, brand themselves. So the Intellex Alliance was actually found by a former Israeli army officer as well, just to drop a fact bomb over there that who the founders of the Intellex Alliance was. So anyway, the Intellex Alliance has kind of rebranded itself that it follows EU regulation, but at the same time, it's been exporting its surveillance technology across the world, and we have found cases in 25 countries, which is quite a big amount, and probably there is more to come. And it's quite unfortunate. Like even years, I think it's been 3 years since the Pegasus revelations in 2021, that we are still seeing this spyware industry kind of go out of control. A recent political piece also described the EU as being a wild west of spyware. So yeah, we need to, while we are reporting on this issue, first of all, we shouldn't be pursuing double standards, but at the same time, it is important that the global north countries, especially the EU bloc, the US and so on and so forth, who try to champion human rights and democracy, they impose outright bans and binding regulation on the exports and development of such technologies. I will end myself over here, and happy to take any questions.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه.
Thank you so much for this feedback and for the examples that you shared with us. We move to you, Raya, and then we open the floor for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today to listen a bit more about spyware and surveillance. So my name is Raya. I work as a digital security trainer, and I kind of research surveillance. It's become a topic of obsession since the Pegasus project, which was released in, I think, June 2021 by Forbidden Stories, Amnesty, and colleagues. So my center of gravity kind of switched from having fun and enjoying life to being obsessed about surveillance and surveillance software. So one thing that's very important to note, at least in a conference like this that brings together investigative journalists from across the Arabic-speaking region, is that among the first spyware cases found were among journalists in the region, or human rights defenders too. So in 2016, when Citizen Lab published its first report called The $1 Million Dissident, they were uncovering the case of Pegasus against Ahmed Mansour, which he's a current detainee in Emirati prisons, and he was being targeted by spyware over the years, and they were able to target or notice and observe the Pegasus infection on his device in 2016. Following Ahmed Mansour was perhaps a name that everyone knows, is Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi is an interesting case because they didn't just target Jamal, they also targeted everyone in his circle and from his friends and colleagues, his wife, his fiance, and even colleagues who live in exile. Omar Abdul Aziz, who's in exile, a Saudi dissident who lives in exile in Canada, was targeted by Pegasus. Like I said, his wife and his fiance. His friend Yahya Asiri, who happens to have founded Al-Qasd, which is an organization that uncovers human rights violations in the Gulf countries. Yahya found that he had Pegasus. He lives in exile in the UK. For a long time, someone was managing Al-Qasd, which was Ala al-Siddiq. Ala al-Siddiq is also an Emirati activist. She was living in exile in London up until 2021 when she faced a car accident. Some claim that it was an intentional car accident, that she was killed. Later on, her device was tested and found that she had been targeted with Pegasus over, I think, 4 years. So from 2016 until 2021, until her death. Ala al-Siddiq was the executive director of Al-Qasd up until her death. And so this is just to show how much we as people living in this region are very much targeted. There are multiple reasons for it. I think you pointed out one important reason is that a lot of these spywares, they come from one place, which happens to be the Israeli occupation. I think we all know that by now. There are some older ones that used to come from other countries like Italy and so on. What was the company called? Hacker Team? Or Hacker News, not Hacker News. But so Pegasus is actually built by the NSO company. NSO is a company that's based in the Israeli occupation and hires people who have graduated from the Israeli Cyber Intelligence Unit 8200. A Predator, another spyware that is found among journalists in the region and also human rights defenders, was founded by Intellexa Group. Intellexa Group was founded by Tal Dillian, who's also, like you said, graduated from the Israeli Cyber Intelligence. He just happens to be in Cyprus because he found a financial loophole to be able to establish himself in Cyprus. There's a fascinating investigation that Amnesty and ICIJ and the colleagues did on this, and you should read it. So yeah, we kind of become a testing field for these surveillance companies. So it starts with us, and then they market it as a very successful tool to be able to control people, control their movements, and control what they're doing. One of the latest cases that I'd like to highlight. So you highlighted the case of Predator. Another one was the case against Ahmed Tantawi. Do folks know who Ahmed Tantawi is? Or perhaps those who are from Egypt. So he happens to be a front runner against Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in the elections against Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Ahmed Tantawi in September approached Citizen Lab saying that he suspects that his phone has been compromised. So they do a test on his phone and find that he was sent a link in September 2021, claiming that his WhatsApp was hacked. He had clicked the link, and by clicking the link, the Predator spyware was installed on his phone. Now, when we say spyware, that means that it has full access to the device. So it can open the camera, the mic, it can see files, messages, your photos. It's a little spy sitting on your phone for a few days, having fun until it exits the device. What they had found, Citizen Lab, is that he had received the same links in May 2023. They weren't sure whether he had clicked the link or not. What was even more interesting, that in late August, September 2023, so we're now talking just a month or two ago, they had found that he was also targeted with spyware, but via his internet network. So they had found that there were 3 different or 4 different times during August where there was an attempt to inject spyware into his device via an internet network. They weren't sure whether it was his home's Wi-Fi network or his 4G network that he was connected to. He happens to be subscribed to Vodafone Egypt. So eventually they came to the conclusion that it was through his Vodafone network. And actually, Vodafone is complicit here. Vodafone Egypt was complicit. They had let's say an instrument within their telecommunications infrastructure that was targeting Ahmed al-Tantawi at all times, trying to inject the spyware into his device until it was successful. The only thing they were waiting for is for Ahmed to visit an unsecure website so they can intercept this communication, enter in his device. And this was a pretty mind-blowing revelation, because here you're talking about a British multinational who's complicit in facilitating the surveillance of people within a country. And so another important thing to note out, which is another leak that came out last year, I think by the New York Times, that this is something that is also very costly for states. So states tend to pay lots of money. There was a leak that showed that for 20 infections, predator infections specifically, at the same time, Androids or iOS, it costs a state 13.6 million euros. So if you divide that by 20, that's approximately 650 million euros per infection. So if you are successful, if your phone was successfully infected by Predator or Pegasus, know that your state paid maybe $500,000 just on your on hacking your phone. So you deserve a medal, maybe, I don't know. So yeah, it is a very costly thing, and people tend to think, yeah, okay, it's costly. I'm just a journalist. They're definitely not going to target me. And I think this is something we should not take lightly at all, because what we've seen, and like I said previously, is that they do target lots of journalists, and journalists tend to be the first people they target, specifically investigative journalists, or let's say people who tend to speak loudly against their own regimes. So the advice, therefore, is to test. I mean, it's like going to the doctors. So testing your device is free. You have Amnesty here, Amnesty Tech. You have Citizen Lab. You have Access Now. All of them run some form of hotline that's free and that you could use. And what's advisable then, just to test, we run a digital safety clinic at the, what's it called? The Venus Room in -2. If you also want to test your device, it's very much advisable. Better to test than never know whether you are targeted with spyware. If you live in countries that are in the region or are from these countries, even if you live in the US or anything, you are all targeted. There is no requirement or eligibility requirement that makes you more prone to being targeted or not. So that's one advice. But another thing, I guess, because I don't want to also instill fear, I feel like that's the role of the states and not me, is probably also to do some form of, let's say, protection that you could do. If you are an Apple iPhone owner, Apple did a very good thing late last year, October of last year. They released a feature called lockdown mode, which you could find if you go to settings, privacy and security, scroll down and click on lockdown mode. Currently, we know that lockdown mode is the best protection against spyware attacks. So far, those who have turned on lockdown mode have protected their devices from 100% of spyware attacks. And we know that even Ahmed al-Tantawi, because he had it on, the network injection actually failed. We know that in Mexico, in I think March of this year, they tried to also target journalists with Pegasus, and the infections failed because they had lockdown mode on. Unfortunately, this feature is not yet available on Androids. So if you want to purchase an iPhone, I would advise it. So this is one thing you could do. And there are other things if you want. There are many advices you could take and follow if you want to limit the harms of surveillance and so on. But we shouldn't lose hope. I think as long as we have folks like Amnesty, folks like Citizen Lab and Access Now working to defend against these kinds of attacks, we're in a good place. Thank you.
Thank you. شكرا كثير رايا.
Thank you so much, Raya, for sharing these rich examples that I think clarify, that are clear to me and to some of the, I guess, clarifying the importance of such cases, and that we should not believe about ourselves. Why should we be subjected to such threats, or should we be targeted? So thanks for the advice. Based on your interventions and feedback and some of the questions we received, let's do some classification or sorting, 1 to 3 basic or main risks that you think the journalists and fact checkers should take into consideration as the most dangerous or risky and should be aware of them.
This is a tricky question because, like, I believe the lady is gonna focus on surveillance, so I will stick to the social media platforms. Like disinformation, AI generated content is like highly dangerous, and we can see how it's weaponized, how people are willing to share disinformation, and how there's literally lack of investment from social media platforms to combat disinformation on their platforms. So I would say that disinformation is really putting everyone at risk. Connecting that with the year of democracy, it's one of the most dangerous things that people are facing on social media platforms. And I do think that it's more challenging even with the journalists and fact checkers, because it's part of their job to check everything. And we've seen how like sometimes media outlets are also trapped with disinformation that's spread all over, especially with the current and ongoing crisis. So disinformation, AI generated content that could be weaponized is one of the of the risks that we should keep in mind. The other thing is the privacy when it comes to the social media platforms, like doxing and defaming journalists, and more particularly female journalists, activists, and human rights defenders is really, really dangerous. Like in my work, I've met people who left their country because they were doxed. Their life was at risk. They were threatened, attacked. And that was basically also that affected their mental health, as Hajra mentioned a couple of minutes ago. It puts them at risk, and that's why we usually stress more on how there should be more resources invested to protect people, especially from such digital threats. So I would highlight those mainly.
Hajra?
Thank you. As you rightly pointed out, Ahmed Mansour's case as well. I just want to highlight that, Ahmed Mansour was also known as the last human rights defender in the UAE. He's in prison, and we are also campaigning for his release, and especially right now as COP28 is also taking place. Ahead of the COP28, we did have a lot of concerns coming at Amnesty Tech about targeted surveillance, especially in in the Emirates. And I think Ahmed Mansour's case is also an emblem of that. It's kind of interesting that how the UAE and these countries project themselves as these diplomatic havens to have these massive conferences, and then of course it is actually on the governments, and especially like the powerful big global north governments, to kind of put more pressure on these companies so that they do not let these spyware surveillance country mushroom in their own lands and then be exported to abusive governments globally as well. And then it is also important for governments, including in the UAE, to let people use apps like Signal that are safe and encrypted as well. But yeah, from a more global perspective, as I've highlighted before as well, and as Raya pointed out as well, it's kind of like a tiny spy in your pocket, and it does, psychologically speaking, I think it does have like a very big impact, and it also crushes our rights of expression and freedom. So it is important that we need, as soon as possible, an outright ban on such abusive technologies, and governments should really shepherd that in due course.
رايا هناك سؤال من الحاضرين.
There is a question by the online audience. In case, as a journalist, you learned that your device has been penetrated or hacked, what is the immediate procedures that you should take?
Okay. So most people tend to stay with the same phone. If they find that they have Pegasus on their phones, Predator, they keep the same phone. Previously, people were told just buy a new phone, format this one and buy a new one. But people are now keeping the same phone. The advice is, one thing to know about these spyware, they don't stay forever on the device. It's very costly for a state to keep targeting your phone. So one advice is to potentially just back up your data, photos and files, maybe format the device quickly, and then just keep using your phone. If it's an iPhone, you can just quickly put lockdown mode and you'll be fine. You can keep using your device. But the other step to take, because the spyware will see the passwords you put for your accounts, so it's good to change your passwords and so on. The other advice too, which I think is difficult, is to just inform people you tend to talk to that you're targeted, so they know that their conversations were also surveyed at some point. But yeah.
شكرا جزيلا. مع الأسف
Thank you all. Unfortunately, the time for the session is now over. There are so many other questions, but unfortunately, we don't have the time or the chance to give the chance to our audience here to ask their questions, but our guests are here now. If you have any questions or inquiries about their work, please contact with them directly. Thank you, everybody, for our panelists or for being here. And we wish you a good day with good sessions. Thank you all.